completely different from all of you who have personal experience. It all started one day after I had moved to West Virginia, and I was wandering around a small West Virginia town, and on the edge of downtown, I came across a synagogue. And I was actually shocked to see this synagogue, because as far as I knew, all Jews lived in metropolitan areas. So I was starting from a place of total ignorance, really. And I became curious and decided to find out about this little congregation, and happened to be taking a class in local Jewish history, I'm sorry, not local Jewish history, local history, how to do methods for researching local history, and we could pick any topic we wanted. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll find out how the synagogue ended up in this little town of Clarksburg. So I just thought I would do that one paper for this one class, but it kind of grew and grew and grew and grew. And it took me a while. So 9 years later, I had a dissertation. And 13 years after that, I had this book, Coalfield Jews, which covered southern West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia, and was the first book written about Jews in Appalachia. So that might seem like going to extreme lengths just to satisfy my curiosity. But I think that this project is important for two reasons. First, the literature on American Jewry has always focused on big cities, especially New York. And for a more complete picture, we really need to hear the stories of Jews who grew up in small towns across America. The small town experience provides a very different perspective on important issues like relations between Jews and non-Jews, Jewish identity, maintaining religious life. Secondly, the history of Appalachia has also been seen in very narrow terms. Very little has been written, and still to this day, even though I did my study 20 years ago, there's been some more writing about the different ethnic groups that have lived here, but not a lot. And as a result, when people talk about the region, they often deal in stereotypes. So my work challenges common notions of both Jews and of Appalachia. So this afternoon, I thought what I would do would be to lay the groundwork for all of the weekend's activities for the Middlesboro folks, and I hope some of the rest of you would join us too. So today I thought this afternoon I would touch on the different aspects of the history of the Jews of southeastern Kentucky. In other words, how those people who are buried in the Middlesboro Cemetery found their way to the region, and a little bit about their experiences there. And then this evening at the talk, what we're doing then, I'm going to do a slideshow presentation with lots of great visuals to focus in on some of the highlights with this slideshow, and talk a little bit more about, a little more anecdotes about the families and that kind of thing. So to get started, how people got there. Let's start with Esther Sherman Scott. I don't know if there's any Shermans here, but Shermans were a big part of the Coalfields. She arrived in the town of Poor Fork, Kentucky, with her 2-year-old son around 1911, straight from her small hometown in Ukraine. And her first reaction was, to put it mildly, disappointment. After traveling across the ocean and parts of 2 continents, she had landed in a place that seemed even less refined than the shtetl she had come from. And when she saw her husband David's store, she said, "In Europe, they keep their cows in a better place." So her husband, David Scott, had arrived in America the previous year. He had landed in Baltimore, where Esther's brother, Mike Sherman, was already an established businessman. And Sherman had become aware that something was going on in southeastern Kentucky. Coal mines were just starting to be opened, workers were moving in, and that offered opportunity to entrepreneurs. So he sent his greenhorn brother-in-law into the mountains and financed that little store. Sherman, in fact, was blessed with 5 sisters, and as each one married, he sent the newlywed couple to a different town in southeastern Kentucky. So for decades, the region's 2 Jewish congregations would be full of Sherman family members who came in from the surrounding area for the high holidays. And other families here have experienced the same thing, like the Eusters, the Kahns, and the Sturms. Because once they got to the Coalfields, they kind of spread out a little bit into all these really tiny towns. So the Scott's family story typified the Jewish Coalfield experience, because one thing that was kind of a coincidence, but kind of set the whole thing off, is that the great migration of Eastern European Jews to America from 1880 to 1920 happened to coincide almost exactly with the opening of southern Appalachia to coal mining, which couldn't start up until railroads were finally constructed through the steep mountains. And there was always coal here, but there was no way to transport it anywhere until they were able to get the railroads to come through. So when this happened, there were a few Jewish businessmen in cities like Baltimore, New York, Cincinnati, who had found out about this and recognized that this suddenly growing region would need retailers. So they encouraged immigrants to come here, often on these new rail lines that had just been built. And these new arrivals often started out as peddlers. And once they found a foothold, they in turn encouraged their own relatives and friends to join them in a process that actually happens with all great movements of people, and that historians long ago gave the name of chain migration. Another factor that caused people to come to the coal fields, in addition to chain migration, historians also talk about push and pull factors. So in order for a lot of people to move to a new place, there has to be something pulling them. And in this case, it was the economic opportunity, the opportunity to establish a business, which was important to many Jews who didn't necessarily just want to work in the garment district in New York. But there also has to be push factors. There has to be a reason to leave. Otherwise, you wouldn't, even with the opportunity, you wouldn't bother. Why bother? So the push factor also was largely economic because there was great competition in the cities. There was a lot of hardship and poverty. And also, in some cases, there were other reasons, like, for example, with the Sturm family, there was a typhoid epidemic in New York, which finally convinced the patriarch Chaim Sturm and his wife to come out with their kids, and they too would establish a large family through the coal fields. So through these push and pull factors and the chain migration and these networks of Jews sort of having a flow into the region, enough Jews gathered to form the two congregations that existed in southeastern Kentucky, which were actually one big congregation, but in two different eras, based in two different places. In the early period, the congregation was based in Middlesboro. This was from around 1900 to into the 1920s, or really the 1890s into the 1920s. And then about 25 years later, when Middlesboro wasn't doing as well and Harlan was being established, Harlan became the base for the congregation of this region. And these towns had what you might call a critical mass of Jewish people, but just barely. Their congregations also drew on the surrounding towns for members, places like Pineville, Everts, Hazard, Corbin, and Porfork. Actually, it wasn't called Porfork for long. When David Scott arrived there in 1910, he opened the only store in town. He was the first real merchant in this area that was just being developed. And this village began to grow, aided by its proximity to the U.S. Steel coal mining complex. He was concerned that the name Porfork didn't really send the right message. So he lobbied to have the name changed, and Porfork became known as Cumberland. So this is just one example of the role played by Jewish merchants in the coal fields. In the smallest towns where they settled, Jewish families made up a large portion of the merchant class. Sometimes they were the entire merchant class. And I'm talking about very small towns here. But in the larger towns, they became key members of a small upper middle class of merchants and professionals who provided goods and services to the local economy, which was otherwise completely dominated by the coal industry. And Jewish retailers were big town boosters, dedicated to seeing their towns grow and progress. The Weinstein brothers, for example, arrived in Middlesboro as peddlers, and we have somebody from the, Mike Burnett is a member of the Weinstein family. Within a short time, these immigrants from Lithuania, Sam and Herman Weinstein, were being lauded in the local newspapers for their involvement in here's one quote from a newspaper: "They're involved in every public enterprise for the improvement of living, social, educational, and civic conditions." And I'll talk more about them this evening and also the other families that I'm going to mention in this talk. But for now, I'll just quote from another article about Sam Weinstein, who called him, quote, very popular with the boys at the mines. So now this picture doesn't really jibe with the stereotypical view of coal towns as places where coal companies imposed rigid measures to control their workforce and force miners to shop in company-owned stores. Now that view is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. For one thing, there were different kinds of towns in the coal fields. Plenty of company towns, completely owned by the companies, but also small independent towns, from these small hamlets like Cumberland and Everts to larger boom towns like Middlesbrough, to county seats like Harlan and Pineville. Even as the coal industry exerted tremendous power over the region, the coal boom fostered a wide open atmosphere that created opportunities for social and economic mobility for people who flocked to these independent towns from all over. Because the towns themselves didn't have a big enough population when the coal boom started. People had to come in from elsewhere. So you had a place where there was a lot of people from the outside, not a lot of established, hierarchies, that kind of thing. And Jews, as a result, played a wide-ranging role in the Coalfield civic and social scene, from respectable leading citizens to participants in the senior side of Coalfield life. And I do talk about this quite a lot in my book because it's more fun, for one thing. It helped that they arrived in the very early days. Coalfield towns actually conform to a pattern that's really evident around the world. That is, boomtown conditions have often been hospitable to Jews. And this is the case in Europe, in America, all over. In frontier towns in the American West, for example, local elites saw entrepreneurial newcomers as one person, a historian put it, fellow promoters in an expanding economy rather than as competitors in a static economy. So they welcomed newcomers. A similar situation existed in Appalachia's newly opened coal fields. And this is something, at the time I wrote it, I wasn't thinking about conditions today, but we might want to think a little about that in relation to what's going on today somewhat. Now, the boomtown of Middlesbrough was founded by British coal interests in 1888. So it wasn't just this little place off in the middle of nowhere. It was actually started as part of a global enterprise, really. And it was the first town created by the coal boom in the region of eastern Kentucky. And its rise was spectacular. In only 2 years, it had 3,000 residents, including around 15 Jewish families. However, the national financial panic of 1893 caused the town to crash, and most of the population just moved away. They hadn't been there very long, and they just up and left. Several Jewish merchants remained, however, including the Weinsteins, and their loyalty to their new home may account for the praise that was heaped upon them by the local press as the town recovered. A local historian later wrote that the Jewish community had been one of the main forces holding the town together during the bust days of the 1890s. So it's unclear why Jewish merchants might have been more willing to gamble on the town's recovery than those who left. Maybe they simply had less to lose. It's also possible that they were able to tolerate a higher degree of financial uncertainty, since Jewish businesses in Europe had typically existed under precarious conditions. But in any case, their gamble paid off, since Middlesbrough reemerged around 1900 as the leading town of southeastern Kentucky, with a population of more than 7,000 by 1910. In that year, Middlesbrough had a Jewish population of around 80, which was probably about its height. Many Jewish families stayed in the coal fields long enough to participate in town development over several generations. So it wasn't just a flash in the pan kind of thing. The Euster family constructed, as the local historian there says, they constructed the fourth brick building in Bell County, the seat of Pineville, around 1890. And in the 1960s, almost 70 years later, Abe Euster served as Pineville's mayor. A man named Alex Gergley opened an early department store in Harlan, And his son, Irvin, served on the Harlan City Council and was president of the Lions Club, the Harlan Country Club, and the local Red Cross. And again, I will be talking about some of these families more this evening. By saying this, I don't mean to suggest that Jews never faced local prejudice. Bigotry in the Coalfields was there, just like it's everywhere. For example, during the Depression, a restaurant in Harlan offered a 15-cent meal that included a drink called Jew Pop, which was water. The expression Jew him down was commonplace, although it's interesting that people who used the expression didn't always realize that it was about Jews. It was just an expression to them. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan became popular across the nation, actually, and the Coalfields were no exception. Yet the Klan's popularity was brief, and it was generally frowned on by local authorities, which certainly wasn't the case elsewhere. The Middlesbrough City Council banned public speech that would incite hatred between races and classes, and actually made it illegal to wear a mask in public, which is another interesting resonance. And the local KKK chapter actually couldn't get any churches to provide them with meeting space. So this gets at, a key feature of boomtowns that I've been talking about. They tended to be tolerant of all kinds of people. And the Coalfields were actually much more multicultural than is generally known. A labor shortage for the coal operators caused them to recruit blacks as well as Italian and Eastern European immigrants. Greek and Arab immigrants joined Jews as local business people. So it was really a multicultural place, which is hard to believe when you kind of go through places today. Ethnic and racial tensions did exist, but most people understood that this kind of diversity was needed in order for the towns to prosper, and people generally got along. Now, as for tolerance of all kinds of behavior, of course, that's what boomtowns are known for. It would certainly be misleading to represent Coalfield Jews only as sober-minded business people and civic leaders. Jews had always been involved in the liquor trade in Middlesbrough, which was a key profit maker in a place filled with young, single male workers. When Prohibition came along, they weren't about to let it dampen their activities. So Ike Ginsburg, whose interests ran to bootlegging and gambling, served as mayor of Middlesbrough in the 1930s, and a local grand jury accused him of openly allowing saloons, casinos, and brothels to operate in the city. Facing charges of corruption, Ginsburg's tenure was limited to only one term. But guess what wasn't an issue? His religion. That was not part of the objection to Ike Ginsburg. Now, Ginsburg's cousin, Jack Zuda, is someone I should talk about because he's one of the more prominent people buried in the Middlesbrough Cemetery. Zuda, Z-U-T-A. He lived in Middlesbrough for a little while, but then he went to Chicago and developed a career as a mobster, but would return every year to spend the high holidays with his relatives. And in 1930, he was assassinated in a gangland hit. He was part of the Bugs Moran gang, which was fighting the Al Capone gang. And after he was killed, his body was brought to Middlesbrough. We will be seeing his grave tomorrow if we get a chance to walk around. And on the day of his funeral, all the Jewish stores in town closed, and practically the whole town attended the funeral. And his obituary noted that he had been a member of the Middlesbrough Country Club and the Elks. But an article right next to the obituary reported all the details of his murder and his last desperate days on the run from the mob. So that was Middlesbrough in the 1920s and 30s. But despite this attempt to carry on business as usual based on the liquor industry and that kind of thing, Prohibition did cause boomtowns like Middlesbrough to basically decline. And this was one reason the county seats replaced the boomtowns as centers of Coalfield life. And so the center of the Jewish community in southeastern Kentucky shifted to the town of Harlan, which was the county seat of Harlan County. And speaking of the Jewish community, so far I've drawn a picture of Jewish families who willingly placed themselves in a completely non-Jewish environment and who got along well with their neighbors. But this doesn't mean that they weren't concerned with maintaining their religion or their Jewish identity. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. As early as 1891, the Middlesbrough newspaper reported that the town's 15 or so Jewish families were already discussing the possibility of a synagogue. But these plans were dashed when the financial crash happened. In 1897, the newspaper related that Knoxville's Rabbi Winnick had recently visited to circumcise the baby son of William and Bertha Haar and to, quote, ratify the marriage of a couple who had eloped, William's 17-year-old sister Sadie and 23-year-old Ike Ginsburg, the future mayor. And Rabbi Winnick would continue to come up for important occasions throughout his time in Knoxville. In 1904, the death of Ike and Sadie's 6-year-old daughter led to the founding of the Jewish cemetery in Middlesbrough on land donated by Sadie's father, fruit store owner Ben Haar, who stipulated that the lots be given out for free. Evidence shows that a congregation was probably founded the very next year, although it left no records, so its history is sketchy, even down to its name, which one source refers to as Temple of Zion. The congregation never built a synagogue, but it did establish quarters in Middlesbrough's Masonic Hall, where Sam Weinstein led Orthodox services in the 1900s, 1910s, into the 1920s. For many years, the congregation wavered between Orthodox, conservative, and Reform worship, which I think everybody here is probably familiar with, because in a small community you can't always people don't have the option of branching out into forming different congregations based on their affinity for one of those things. When Louis Sturm came to town in the late 20s, he started leading Reform services, and they kind of coexisted with Sam Weinstein with the Orthodox services and Lou Sturm with Reform. Women, meanwhile, formed their own groups, including a Daughters of Zion club, and later even had a Hadassah chapter. So this shows that people were not just focused on their own little area, but they really were worldly enough to know what was going on in the larger Jewish world. Jews in Middlesbrough and Harlan also had their own informal Jewish social life. In Middlesbrough, a restaurant run by Bertha Haar, known as Mother Haar, served as the main gathering place for Jews. She even had matzo ball soup and chopped liver on the menu, and I'm guessing that Jews were the only ones who were eating those things. So a special closeness between the Jewish families lent a very strong dynamic to social and religious life. They didn't always get along, but they were still close. With Jewish families coming in from miles around at the high holidays and other special gatherings, they really took on a festive air. Each meeting was like a family reunion. And in fact, each meeting was a family reunion because the members were related to each other. So as I mentioned, the area's center of Jewish life shifted to Harlan in the 1930s. At that time, only around 60 Jews lived in Harlan. Middlesbrough's had probably dropped some. They held their first high holiday services in 1931. And a few weeks later, 10 men met in Saul Geller's store to organize what they called Congregation B'nai Sholem of Southeastern Kentucky, which was an indication that from the start, the group intended to serve Jews living in towns all around the Cumberland Gap. And its first meeting actually drew a crowd of around 90 people, which I think is pretty impressive. Like its Middlesbrough counterpart, the congregation in Harlan set up permanent space in the local Masonic Hall. And despite organizational support from the Reform movement, who helped them from Cincinnati, the services were conservative. The congregation reached its high point in the late 1940s when around 160 Jews lived in southeastern Kentucky. And this was because of the boom in coal from World War II and the post-World War era, and the region was doing quite well. Visiting rabbis came through, the sisterhood organized Purim parties, Bible readings, and held fundraisers to support the war effort and to support Jewish refugees in the 1930s. So they never had, neither of these congregations ever had their own rabbi, except for the lay leaders like Sam Weinstein and Lou Sturm, who were equipped to conduct services. A joy in coming together to share cherished customs comes through in B'nai Sholom's records, which are housed in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati and were a great source for me. While Middlesbrough records don't exist, the Harlan records do exist. Simchat Torah festivities in Harlem in 1931 and 1932, you can see from the records, really reveled in Yiddishkeit, with participants enjoying Yiddish songs, speeches, and readings. The invitation to the 1932 event announced the joyousest time of the year: gefilte fish, roast chicken, hot parakas, plenty of chrein, a program of jolly good fun. And guests came, they were decked out in costumes, in the congregation minutes, one man, it says, wore a brand new satin capota which reached to his ankles. He donned a long black beard and sniffed imaginary snuff and sneezed most heartily and artistically. So these kinds of examples leave the strong impression that Jews were able to celebrate their Jewish heritage and religion, even as they mixed easily with everyone else. And one of the best examples of this I recently read about, thanks to Mike Burnett, who passed along a memoir of the Weinstein family. During Passover, this was back in Middlesbrough now, the Weinsteins would host large seders for Jews from the surrounding area who came in for services. And then after the holiday, Sam, the committed Orthodox Jew, would give leftover matzah to local churches for use as communion wafers. So I wouldn't be surprised if other families here today could tell similar kinds of stories. Meanwhile, the extensive newspaper coverage given to Jewish communal events revealed a keen interest in traditions and practices of local Jews on the part of the surrounding society. Newspapers informed readers when Jewish congregations celebrated holidays and often provided historical background. Not always correctly, but they tried. A typical Middlesbrough article in 1914 noted that the high holidays would be properly observed by the local Hebrew people in their customary manner, with fasting, services, and all the stores would be closed. So it's very interesting how invested the Middlesbrough and Harlem media seemed to be in covering Jewish social and religious activities. Partly, I think this could be attributed to the Bible Belt's leanings towards Old Testament-style Christianity. But there was also something else at play. It's telling, I think, that the Harlan newspaper gave very prominent coverage to Jewish communal happenings in the early 1930s. The newspaper even printed a small notice submitted by one Jewish communal leader headlined, "Harlan Hebrew Congregation Prays for Safety of Lindbergh Baby." Meanwhile, the newspaper chose not to cover at all the story that basically was consuming everyone in the region, which was the vicious labor management conflict in the Harlan coalfield. This was the period where Florence Reese wrote her famous song, "Which Side Are You On?" with the line, "If you go up to Harlan County, there is no neutral there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair." And her declaration that there was no neutral in Harlan County had a good bit of truth to it. Everyone had to face the ramifications of this class conflict. But Jewish retailers desperately wished that they could be neutral. On the one hand, as business people, they had a financial stake in the system, in the whole coal economy. They were pillars of their communities. They socialized with other merchants, professionals, mining officials, in other words, the local elite. But on the other hand, their businesses depended on good relations with everyone in the community. In small towns where everyone knew everyone else, retailers could not afford to offend any segment of the population. As one Jewish merchant put it, "We were caught in the middle. These are your customers. You don't want to antagonize them." And I think a lot of them also felt very uncomfortable with the way that the mine authorities were attacking the miners and basically throwing them out of evicting them from their company-owned houses when they tried to go on strike, and the whole regime of the gun thugs, which was how the mine guards were basically referred to. But when forced to choose, almost all the merchants sided with members of their own class. And in fact, the intensity of the class divide had the side effect of boosting ethnic and racial unity within each class, adding to this cultural tolerance that I mentioned earlier, sort of ironically. So I can't help but think that the significant coverage of Jewish communal events during the troubled 1930s, and this situation in Harlem lasted for the whole decade practically, was a way to promote class solidarity among the different segments of the Coalfield middle and upper classes. So I'll just touch on a couple other aspects of Jews' relationship with the coal industry, though I really don't have time to go into them here. I will talk a little bit about it later this evening. One is the question of company stores. Clearly, Jewish merchants could not have achieved success if all miners were forced to shop at coal company stores. But that doesn't mean that the charges leveled against the company stores were false. Many, though not all, did attempt to coerce their miners to shop at company stores, and they did ensnare workers in debt, so that it seemed like many miners did owe their souls to the company store. But the coal company's tactics weren't always effective, and miners could find ways to work around them sometimes, and often were not applied consistently. The company stores had a tremendous competitive advantage over independent retailers, but successful Jewish retailers had creative ways of dealing with this, which I go into in my book. And finally, since we're talking about the coal fields, what about Jewish participation in the coal industry? Everybody was always asking me, as soon as they learned that I was studying this topic, were there Jewish coal miners? What were Jews doing there? The fact is, the Jews were mostly merchants. I did find a few Jewish coal miners in my research, but they tended not to be connected to the local Jewish communities, and it was hard to find out any real details about them. And some Jewish merchants were tempted to try their hand at the coal business. They saw all these people making all this money mining coal. But the ones who tried almost all went bust. The only lasting legacy of Jewish participation in the coal industry consists of the town of Tots, Kentucky, named for Harry and Abe Tots, again, who I'm going to talk about this evening. Has anybody here ever heard of Tots, Kentucky? It's still around. It's a little town in Harlan County, named for these two brothers, West Virginia Jewish merchants who came to Tots and who came to this region and even managed to start a little coal company. Didn't last very long. For Jews, the main role of the coal industry was to provide them with a market for selling goods. And in the 1950s, the mechanization of coal mining started to take that market away. As one merchant put it, you can't sell clothes and food to a continuous mining machine. So this mechanization was dramatic. Eastern Kentucky lost about half of its coal mining jobs in the 1950s. So this problems in the coal industry with job losses is not something that just happened recently. As jobs disappeared, although mechanization wasn't the only problem, it was probably the main reason for the job loss at that time. As jobs disappeared over the next couple decades, literally millions of people left the Appalachian coal fields. They say some 3 million people, mostly miners and their families. 1/3 of the people of Eastern Kentucky, all the people, moved away during the 1950s alone. Ultimately, the rule of coal proved to be unsustainable. With complete control over the land, mining interests prevented any kind of real economic diversity, and this dependence on a single industry ultimately led these regions to become pretty economically devastated. Of course, among the people who moved away was virtually the entire Jewish population. And this makes places like the Middlesboro Jewish Cemetery all the more important to keep up as one of the few remnants of Jewish life in the region. As one elderly Jewish Coalfield resident once said to me over 30 years ago, we need places like this to show that Jews lived here at one time. And that's why I feel that what you all are doing here is so important. Thank you. And I'd be glad to take, questions or comments. Yeah.
As a bit of an update on Middlesboro, its economy these days is largely based on Social Security disability. and I was a disability judge there in 2010 and 2011. I'd been and when I say Middlesboroughians, or whatever the title is, they're very fierce in their pursuit of disability, and to the point where I had you can file and then lose and then refile, and the largest number of refilings that I had somebody come before me was 16. And they would gather in Walmart on the 3rd of the month when disability checks came out. You couldn't get into Walmart because everybody was there, and the topic of discussion was, what was the status of your disability? Did you have it? Were you applying? Had you been turned down? And there was, in fact, a judge of at least Jewish heritage. I'm not aware of any affiliation or practice whose name is in the public domain, named Gerald Crafser, who helped this along because he would pay virtually anybody lucky enough to get in front of him until they moved him out of Middlesboro to Kingsport. For reasons that I never really, I knew Judge Crafser, and I was never really able to understand exactly why he was doing this, but he did. So Judge Crafser is the modern day Jew of Middlesboro.
Yeah, back there.
You mentioned that the Sherman family was sending their kids out on missionaries.
Debbie, wait a sec, so that the people won't. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Sherman family had sent kids out to various towns, and I was just wondering, where did they find the spouses for the kids?
Well, the way the story was told to me, which was by Esther Sherman Scott's daughter, Goldie Scott Jaffe, she said that Mike Sherman at that time lived in Baltimore. He later moved out here, but it was after his sister got married in Baltimore, then they would send them out. So but in a lot of cases, the young men would come out as peddlers, and then when they felt it was time to get married, like they started their store, they would go to Baltimore, they would return to Baltimore or Cincinnati into the Jewish community to look for a Jewish bride. There was really very little intermarriage among the Jews, the Eastern European Jews who came here. They would go back, and a lot of these marriages were basically arranged marriages. So that's why these women would come, and they would be like, what am I doing here? And then that's why also women had played a big role in really helping to maintain these Jewish communities, because that was, it wasn't actually their choice necessarily to come to a place like this, and their husbands were working all the time, although women actually worked in the businesses quite a lot themselves also.
Audience to hear.
Well, they can hear you.
Okay.
Talk normally like you.
Thank you so much. She is inspiring me, as she did many years ago, to talk about our heritage and our archives. I'm going to make a pitch for our archives. You're mentioning things that even I didn't know, and I want to mention some names that all of you knew. The Abramses of Middlesboro were part of all of this for many, many generations. I wish the rest of them were here. The Shagans, who had all sorts of people in Appalachia and in Harlan, your family. And we have people here who probably weren't part of the coal company area, but they were the sorts of people that lived in those little places and brought their merchandise into Knoxville. We are, many of us, the remnant of those people, and we are still making history as Jews of small cities, and I wish all of you would become interested in our archives because we're doing the same thing that you have done for Coalfield Jews, and for which we are so grateful. You told me things about my grandfather who I never knew. My parents, my father told me, and he was a child or maybe an infant, when you said that Rabbi Winnick came in to do marriages and legitimize marriages and I didn't know about that, but my father told me that he was a circuit riding rabbi, which I didn't believe, and probably went with horse and buggy to these areas. We are all the descendants of these people. Be aware of it, and please make your knowledge and your history known to our archives. Thank you.
And I'd just like to add to that to be a circuit riding rabbi is one thing if you're in the Midwest and going out to small towns. To be a circuit riding rabbi in the mountains is a lot different.
They told me.
I mean, they had to. I mean, one thing that impressed me, coming from the flattest place on earth, which is Chicago, is how difficult it must have been for these people to really get around. Yes, and they spoke Yiddish, right. The peddlers would show up at these people's places without really speaking the language, but I think they learned awfully quickly. Yeah. Yeah.
Your book talks a lot about immigration and Jewish populations and the different factors affecting immigration, both directly from Eastern Europe and from the bigger cities. Did I remember correctly that at one point the Jewish population of the Coalfields was 10%? And then my second question is, what other ethnic groups were there in the Coalfields?
Great questions. The Jewish population of the Coalfields was never as high as 10%, but what I said actually was that in this one town of Keystone, West Virginia, it got to be 10%. And that in itself was, surprising. Keystone was the boom town of southern West Virginia, the same way Middlesboro was the boom town for southeastern Kentucky. And Keystone, these Jewish families came in with lots of kids, and most of the other people living there were minors, single minors. And so the population was actually 10% Jewish in Keystone, which at the time, this was like 1910, was much higher percentage than, say, the Jews of New York or the Jews of Chicago. So it's just a different way of looking at multicultural, diversity. Everybody thinks of New York as being diverse and these places as not. But if you have that kind of statistics, then you have to really kind of rethink things a little bit. And as far as your other question about other ethnic groups, depending on the particular coal companies recruited in New York, like when people got off the boat. So there were a lot of Hungarian miners who came to certain parts of the coal fields. Italian miners came to southern West Virginia. And in this area, I think there were Italians, Polish miners. So these people were part of the mix too. And in some places, I remember there was a Jewish merchant in Williamson, West Virginia, who spoke Hungarian because he was from Hungary, and there were lots of Hungarian miners. So that really helped him being part of that whole thing. So, and then there were other sort of entrepreneurial people, like, for example, Lebanese people were peddlers, just like Jews, and they came out to places like this, and Greeks also. So I don't know about percentages, but like I said, a lot of these places were small farming communities before the coal boom. So, and then of course, blacks were recruited from Virginia and North Carolina, and these places had a fairly, sometimes sizable black population as well.
Three quick ones. One, I think they were probably descendants of your David Scott that you mentioned. They still had this goes back to the 50s. A descendant still had their store in Kentucky, but they were friends of my parents, and they maintained a home in Knoxville, I think, so their kids could go to school here. several years ago, we spent a Hanukkah evening in Harlan, Kentucky with a bunch of Israeli doctors who got their green card for serving in a rural area. Everybody spoke Hebrew except for the one young woman who was a foreign exchange student from Japan. It was a weird evening. But about where they found their wives, this goes back to the 80s. We were in Whitesburg, Kentucky at Apple Shop, which is an art center in Letcher County, which at that time was considered the poorest county in the country. Apple Shop was created by Johnson during his as time as president, and we went there for a theater. A friend of ours was director there, and Traveling Jewish Theater out of San Francisco was there, but we also saw the local theater company, and we went to the second showing. We drove through Norton, Virginia, past 4 black lung hospitals and Cohen Department Store. So as we go to the second seating of the theater play, and this 2 couples come out, and they're obviously Jewish. And we asked one of the local actors who knew them, yeah, those are the Cohens. They really keep to themselves, are only friendly with the Levies, and they seem to go away in the fall. And then the younger couple was the son of the older couple, and with his, as my husband would have described, she was dressed as if she was going to a play in New York. And Arnold said to the actor, "Where did the wife come from, New York?" He said, "No, but how did you know, New Jersey?"
Anybody else?
Any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you. And I
Yeah,
hope some
thank
of
you
you
so
come
much.
come this evening. Thanks.
Provided a stipend to bring Deborah here, even though she was going to be in Middlesboro. It's just a wonderful time for us to be able to have her here in Knoxville too. So thank you to them as well. Oh, sorry. Okay.